Welcome back to Where We Lie To.
Mm.
Today, we're going to be looking at this sermon called In the Whirlwind, Wisdom, Suffering for the God Who Speaks.
Mm.
And it's based on the book of Job, chapters 24 through 28.
Mm.
And it really tackles this question that I think a lot of us have probably thought about at some point, which is like, where's the justice in a world that seems so broken, you know?
Yeah, for sure. That's a huge theme in these chapters of Job. He really wrestles with that. And the sermon, it kind of focuses in on this tension that you see. You know, the wicked, they seem to be prospering while innocent people are suffering. And sadly, that's something that feels just as relevant, you know, even today.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
you can really feel Job's frustration in these chapters. Like
Yeah.
in chapter 24, he lists all of these injustices. You know, the poor are being exploited, the vulnerables are suffering. He really lays it all out, you know, especially in those first 12 verses. It's pretty intense.
Yeah, it is. And I think what makes it so powerful is that it just taps into this experience that we all have. Like, who hasn't felt cheated by life at some point?
Right.
We have this innate sense of fairness. And so when we see injustice, it just rattles us to our core.
Yeah, it really makes you question everything.
Totally.
And the sermon brings up this quote by C.S. Lewis that I think is so perfect, he says. If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world.
Mm.
And it's like Job's longing for justice, the way he kind of rails against the state of things. I feel like it points to this deeper longing that we all have.
Absolutely. It suggests that maybe this world isn't the end of the story, you know?
Right.
That our desire for things to be, like, for things to be fair
Yeah.
is a hint that there's something more. But, you know, if that's the case, that kind of raises the question, where's God in all of this? You know, if he's truly good and all-powerful, why is the world such a mess?
Yeah, that's the big question. And that's where chapter 28 gets really interesting. It talks about wisdom as this hidden treasure, something that you can't just, you know, buy or mine, like some kind of commodity.
The language is beautiful. But it also raises a lot of questions, like, what does it even mean for wisdom to be hidden? And if it's so elusive, how are we even supposed to find it?
Right, yeah. Especially when in verse 13 it says, man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living. It's like,
Yeah.
are we just doomed to ignorance? Like true wisdom is just beyond our grasp.
It kind of makes you wonder if Job is hinting at the limits of human understanding. Maybe we're just not equipped to really grasp the full scope of God's wisdom. Even with all our searching and striving, we're still missing something crucial.
Okay, so if we can't figure it out on our own, where do we go from there? Does the sermon offer any clues?
Well, it brings in this quote from John Lennox, who says that the Bible, it doesn't give us, you know, the simplistic explanation for suffering, but instead, it points us to the God who has the wisdom to know, the power to act, and the love to care. So it's not necessarily about having all the answers, but it's about recognizing that we're dealing with a God whose ways are far beyond our comprehension.
Yeah, and that's such a different approach than the one that Job's friends take, right?
Right.
They come at him with this very, like, formulaic logic. You're suffering, so you must have sinned. It's very black and white.
Yeah.
But Job's view, the one that emerges from, you know, his wrestling with God, is so much more nuanced.
For sure. And that brings up a really challenging question for all of us. Can we trust God, even when we don't understand his ways? Can we accept that he might have reasons for allowing suffering that are beyond our grasp?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It is. Yeah, it is a tough question to, you know, hold on to faith when you're surrounded by so much pain and confusion. And the sermon kind of grapples with that tension. Like, it acknowledges the very real brokenness of the world, but it still affirms that God is good, even when we don't get it.
Yeah. It's like, how do we make sense of those two things? Like, where do we even begin to find solid ground when everything feels so shaky?
That's where this idea of fearing the Lord comes in. It's kind of the third big point that the sermon tackles. And at first glance, it might sound a little intense, maybe even a bit scary. But Job 28.28, it really unpacks what that phrase actually means.
Yeah. Because it's not about being terrified of God. It's different.
Right. It's not about cowering in fear. You know, think of it more like awe and respect for God's power and authority. It's about recognizing that we're not the center of the universe.
Yeah.
You know, that there's something much greater than ourselves at work. And we need to approach that with humility.
Right. Sometimes I think we get so caught up in demanding answers from God. Like, you're entitled to this full explanation
Yeah.
for everything, but maybe that's not the point.
Exactly. The sermon touches on that, suggesting that God's ultimate goal isn't to, solve all of our intellectual puzzles or satisfy our curiosity. It's about drawing us into a relationship with him.
Okay, so how does that even work? Like, how do we go from wrestling with doubts and demanding answers to having a relationship with God?
Well, this is where things get really interesting, because the sermon brings in the good news of Jesus. It connects this whole idea of fearing the Lord with this idea that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's wisdom.
So it's not just about some, like, abstract concept of wisdom. We're talking about a person, a relationship.
Exactly. The sermon even references 1 Corinthians 1.24, where Paul describes Christ as the power of God and the wisdom of God. And it's through Jesus, through what happened on the cross, that this whole puzzle of justice and wisdom starts to come together.
Because on the cross, we see God entering into our suffering. He's not distant or indifferent to our pain.
Right. And through the resurrection, we see this incredible victory over sin, death, and ultimately injustice. So even though we don't always see justice playing out perfectly in this world, there's this much bigger story unfolding, this promise of ultimate justice and restoration. We're seeing just a tiny sliver of this much grander tapestry, and we have to trust that. Even when we don't see the whole picture, there's a design, a purpose to it all. Yeah, and the sermon points out that even in the midst of all of his pain and questioning, Job eventually arrives at a place of worship. He comes to a deeper understanding of God.
So even though he never gets, like, all the answers he's looking for, he still finds his way back to a place of faith.
Exactly. And that's what's so encouraging. The sermon suggests that. Even when things are tough, when we don't understand, we can choose to lean into God, to trust his wisdom, even if it's hard.
It's almost like those unanswered questions, those times when we feel like life is just plain unfair. Those are the very things that can draw us closer to God.
Yeah, it really is a wild thought, isn't it? Like, the things that shape our faith the most are the very things that could actually bring us closer to God.
It is. And you know what? It reminds me of this quote by C.S. Lewis. He says that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Wow. That's, that's powerful. It's like we can be so busy, just going through the motions, focusing on the good times, that we just kind of tune God out. But then when something really painful happens, when we're forced to confront the hard stuff, that's when we're finally able to hear him.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in those moments of vulnerability, when we're like stripped bare of our illusions of control, that we're most open to hearing God's voice. And maybe that's why, those difficult seasons, those times when we feel so lost and confused, maybe those are the times when God is actually trying to get our attention the most.
So it's not that God causes suffering, but he can use it to get us to pay attention, to draw us back to him.
The sermon definitely seems to suggest that, it reminds us that God is present in all of it, even the hard parts, and that maybe, just maybe, those challenges, those unanswered questions are actually opportunities for us to grow, to deepen our faith, and to draw closer to him.
So as we're wrapping up here, it feels like we're left with more than just answers. It's more like
a challenge. I'd say so, yeah. A challenge to look at the world and our own experiences through a different lens, the lens of faith, to embrace the mystery of God's wisdom and to trust that, even when we don't understand, he's working all things together for good.
And maybe those seemingly unfair situations, those times when we feel like we've been lied to, maybe those are the very things that can open us up to a deeper relationship with God.
It is a thought-provoking idea, isn't it? That the things that make us question might actually be the things that they lead us closer to the one who holds all the answers.
Welcome back to Were We Lied To?
Yeah.
It seems like the answer just might be not if we know where to look. Thanks for joining us on this exploration, Job. And until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep trusting in the God who speaks, even when it's hard,